Great Responsibility, Chapter 36, Time to Talk. To say that Dr. Connors was surprised would be one of the bigger understatements of the year. He stumbled back and sat hard in one of the chairs that sat around one of the lab tables. She looked just like her mother, but she had her father's eyes. It took him a moment to find his voice.
Piper Parker? How?
Piper sighed and sat down on the floor in front of the door. She explained what little she knew about how her parents had left her behind. She left out the strange room, the still missing briefcase, and the USB drive. She wasn't quite sure who to trust. And then my uncle died. A few years later, I got bit by a genetically altered Oscorp spider. Decided I wanted to do some good in the world, but I have some questions. Dr. Connors nodded.
I'm sure you do. I'll try and answer them as best I can. I worked with your father pretty closely, but I didn't know your mother all that well.
Piper nodded. What was he like? I barely remember him anymore. Dr. Connors stood and began pacing.
He was kind. He always made sure everyone in the lab took care of themselves. Dedicated to helping people. He and I were working on a gene therapy to regrow severed limbs. We also worked on the Stark Industries and telecrops. He said he wanted to make the world a better place for the generations that came after us. He was so excited when he found out your mother was having you. They both were. Mr. Stark, too, they were pretty friendly with him.
Piper held her tongue. She'd always known that Tony had to have at least known her parents. She hadn't known how close they'd apparently been.
He was pretty secretive about his past. He never talked about it at all, actually. Your mother either. I guess in hindsight, all I really knew about them was what we worked on together.
Piper sighed, running a hand through her hair. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. Apparently no one knew them well. Piper hung her head, staring down at the mask in her hands. She felt a hand on her shoulder.
If you ever get the chance, talk to Tony Stark about them. He seemed to know them best, before they left for Oscorp. None of us knew why they did that.
Piper smiled at Dr. Connors, though it was somewhat strained. She took a deep breath and pulled her mask back on. Thank you, Dr. Connors. I appreciate you not lying to me. You might honestly be the first who hasn't withheld something from me, and I really appreciate that. Before Dr. Connors could ask what she meant, she pulled the table aside and unlocked the door. I gotta get home. I have some things to think about. Dr. Connors nodded as she left. He wasn't quite sure what she'd meant by that, but he could only hope that she wouldn't decide to do something stupid. Piper snuck into her room and snagged the box from under her bed. After a moment of thought, she pulled her mask back on and slipped the box into her backpack. She swung off towards a friend. Eddie was working on his calculus homework in his tiny apartment when there was a knock on his window. He jumped. It shouldn't have been possible for anyone to be at his window. There was a fire escape, but he thought... No, he couldn't have heard anything. He touched his pencil back to the paper, and there was another knock. No one could really blame him for being paranoid. He lived in a tiny shithole apartment. He'd been saving for years, and he'd finally turned 18 a few months ago, so the orphanage had kicked him out. He'd gotten a job freelancing as a photographer for newspapers around town, mainly the Bugle, but that barely paid the bills. He grabbed his baseball bat and made his way over to the window. He pulled back the curtain, fully ready to bash whoever it was in the head. He froze when he spotted who it was sitting in his window.
Piper?
Piper grinned as Eddie set down the bat and opened the window. She slipped into the room and smiled. She looked a bit rumpled, and for some reason Eddie couldn't even begin to fathom her shirt was on inside out. Hi, Eddie. You said I could drop by if I ever needed anything. Eddie nodded.
I did. I kind of thought you'd come in through the door, though.
Piper shrugged. Your doorman is intimidating. Eddie frowned. His doorman did have a big scar on his face, but he was actually a very nice man, and Piper wasn't one to judge someone by their appearances.
Okay, but it's 23 stories up, and the...
Piper cut across him. Listen, Eddie, I need your help. She explained her dream and her visit to her parents' old house, and her visit to her aunt and uncle's. She rummaged around in her bag until she found the box. The only thing she left out was her conversation with Dr. Connors. I haven't had the courage to open it by myself, and I didn't know who else to go to. I'm not sure who I can trust right now. But everything else from my dream was real, so it might have something to do with why your parents were on that plane too. I can't do this on my own, Eddie. And if it does have something to do with that, you deserve to know too. Eddie stared down at the box in his best friend's hand. It took him a minute, but he nodded and took it from her.
How do we open it?
Piper took a deep breath and reached into the box. She flicked a nearly microscopic switch and turned the box over. The false bottom of the box came out, and Piper hesitated. Eddie reached for the box carefully and slowly pulled it up off the bottom that still rested in Piper's hand. A slim silver USB sat on top of the false bottom in her hand. She let out a shaky breath and picked up the USB before carefully flipping it over. Her eyes went wide, and the false bottom of the box fell from her hand. Eddie stared at the USB, just as shocked as Piper.
Piper, I don't think your parents were scientists.
Piper couldn't even nod. All she could do was stare at the symbol on the USB. The symbol that had only become widely known since a wormhole had opened above her home and spat out hundreds of invading aliens. The SHIELD logo stared up at her, dusty and old, but still plain as day. Chapter 37, Files. Piper choked out a breath as she stared at the USB drive in her hand. Eddie was shaking slightly. He could only watch as tears spilled down Piper's face.
You didn't know?
Piper shook her head. I had no idea. She stared down at the USB drive in her hands. It took a moment of silence before she was able to speak again. Can I borrow your computer? Eddie nodded and grabbed his backpack. He pulled out his computer and knocked his homework aside.
Your computer's probably faster and all around better than mine.
Piper nodded and handed Eddie the USB. Yes, but it's also connected to the Stark Industries mainframe, and I'm not sure who I can trust right now. And we can do a hardware and software update on your computer later if you want, as a thank you for helping me. Eddie shook his head.
No need to thank me, though I won't turn down the update if you want to.
Piper let out a slight laugh as Eddie booted up his computer and plugged in the USB. It took a moment to boot up, and then the screen of Eddie's computer went black and a box popped up in the center of the screen. It simply read, Password.
Do you have a password?
Piper frowned. No, I don't. The computer beeped. Voice print recognized. Subject identified. Welcome, Piper Parker. The screen lit back up, and this time displaying a white screen with a barely visible outline of the SHIELD logo behind it. Behind the two files there. One of them was labeled Testimony. The other was labeled Piper. Eddie backed off the keyboard and let Piper sit down in front of the computer. She sat down hard, her lip trembling. She swiped at her eyes and clicked the file that was under her name. There was what appeared to be a digital copy of their will in the file and a video. Eddie cleared his throat. He made to move for the door, but Piper grabbed his arm. Stay? Please? Eddie nodded and sat down next to her. She nodded and took another shaky breath. She clicked on the video and tensed as an image of her father and mother popped up on the screen. It took a second for her to muster up the courage to press play.
Piper, if you're watching this, then the worst has happened and your mother and I are gone. There's so much we should have told you. So much I hoped I'd never have to share. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Her mother put a hand on his shoulder and smiled at the camera. You should know, we never wanted to leave you. We did what we did to protect you. Her father nodded. Watching this means you're old enough to understand that we aren't regular scientists. Your mother is a field agent for an organization called SHIELD. the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement, and Logistics Division. And I worked in the science department for that same division. That's how we met.
Richard took his wife's hand and smiled at her. Piper smiled slightly. Her mother spoke next.
After we got married, we decided we wanted to get out of the life, so we retired. Your father still wanted to help people, so we decided he should stay in sciences. So we went to an old friend of ours, Tony Stark. It was great for a few years, but about a year ago, the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. approached us with one last mission. Something to help make the world a better place for the people who came after us. For you, Piper.
The video cut, and suddenly it was just her father at the computer. He looked mussed up and frazzled.
I'm sorry, Piper. I wish we had more time to record this. But we've been found out. Someone at Oscorp knows we're investigating them. We haven't been able to find out exactly who knows or how much they know, but we know that we need to move quickly. If all goes well, you'll never have to see this video. But if you are watching this, then we didn't make it. I'm including all the video evidence we have on this flash drive. You need to make sure it ends up in the right hands. I hope with all my heart you never have to watch this video, Piper. But know that your mother and I love you. And we did what we did to protect you. We love you, Pipes. I wish there was another way. I wish we hadn't gone back to S.H.I.E.L.D., but we did.
He sighed and took a deep breath.
Please remember that we love you and we want you to be happy no matter what happens to us.
The video went black, and Piper stared at her face in the now black computer screen. There were tears on her face, and that she didn't remember being there before. She shook as she swiped at her eyes. A sob bubbled up in her chest, and she tried to hold it in, but it burst out along with a fresh wave of tears. Eddie pulled her into a hug as she sobbed into his shoulder as her phone began to ring. Luke shook his head, setting down his phone. Sam frowned and went to pull out his phone, but Ava shook her head.
We don't have time to call her anymore. We need to take down the Dragon Man robot now, before it hurts anyone.
Danny nodded, placing a hand on Sam's shoulder.
I am sure the spider has a good reason for not answering. The spider usually has a reason for the things she does.
Nova nodded, and they began to step forwards when someone pointed to a roof across from them.
Looks like we were worried for nothing,
Ava said as she watched the figure swing in. Then they all gasped as the figure fired a ball of webbing at the Dragon Man robot. It went right through the robot, taking the core with it. The figure then leapt from the building and kicked the powering down robot, landing on top of it, finally coming into the light of a street lamp. The whole team froze. They hadn't actually seen him before, and his YouTube videos had all been blurry. All of them were stunned by the figure they saw. The symbol on his chest was all too familiar. It was the same symbol they had seen on the thing that had taken over one of their friends. It could only be Venom.
Okay, now we try calling her again,
Sam said, pulling out his phone.